Welcome to the Win, Make, Give podcast, a Ben Kinney training production, where we discuss the concepts of health, wealth, leadership, and legacy. My name is Chad Himes, and I am joined by my friend Bob Stewart. Bob, what's our word for the day?
Chad, today's word is verses.
Ooh, now that sounds fun, Bob.
Not like Bible verses, but like U.S.
Like Spy versus Spy that we remember from good old Mad Magazine if we go back in time a little bit.
Careful, Chad. They know how old we are now.
All right, Bob, before you tell me a little bit more about this, we want to let everybody know we're launching a new series within our podcast, and we're calling this the Ask Ben series. And we'll tell you a little bit more at the end of the podcast about how you can ask a question. Yet we want to make sure that we're asking Ben the conversational questions that everybody out there wants to hear. This one was sent in by Renee. She was asking Ben a question about hiring and growth. And you've given us the word versus as that word we should be listening to. Bob, tell us all a little bit more.
Yeah, so in the discussion today where Renee asks Ben, when is the right time to hire? And there's a little bit more to the question, but I want you guys to pay attention to this idea that when you make a hire, you have a couple of paths you can go. You can go this path versus this path, and which path you decide to take is going to kind of dictate when you should make that hire, if you should even make that hire. So you'll see what I mean when you get in there, right? We've got two options out of this thing when we make a hire. Just pay attention.
All right, so versus, it's going to be an interesting one. Maybe we'll have a Bob versus Chad or a Bob versus Ben or
arm wrestling.
We'll see what category we have that in. Yet until that time, join us and hear Ben's answer as Renee asks about hiring. All right, Ben, so we have a question from the audience. They have sent in a question directly to me and asked me to put this one on the table. They want us to talk about that moment that you finally need someone else on the bus with you. So you've grown this massive organization. You made your first hire, maybe too soon. You've said you just made that hire because you thought it was the right time. How did you know it was the right time? And every time you've added the growth hires, not just personnel, yet the growth hires of your business, how have you known it's time to make it happen?
It's a great question. And part of our goal in this podcast is to help people transition from having a job to owning a business. And that's really what this person is asking. How do I move to a point where I can give up part of the things that I do every single day and hand that over to somebody else? And then I can start using that extra time to run the business. So what they're really talking about is leverage, Chad. Leverage is when you give up something in your world that you think you could hire somebody for less than what you consider your own hourly rate, and you hire that person to do something. Like for me, my first hire, I said, I'm really poor at data entry, doing things in the computer, making flyers, printing stuff, doing paperwork, writing bills, like all that stuff. That's not my gift. Could I find somebody that if I hired them, I would be able to pay them less per hour than what I'm currently making now? Now, that could be considered leverage if you do one thing. That's you replace that newfound time with something that generates you more money per hour.
And that's not what most people do.
Most people confuse leverage with luxury. Luxury is when you hire somebody to do something and you don't do anything more productive with that time. Good example, I pay somebody to mow my lawn. Now, I wouldn't have mowed my lawn during work hours. I would have mowed my lawn after work. So when I get home, instead of mowing my lawn, I am taking that time and I'm going to watch Netflix. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to cook something.
You take baths.
I'm going to take a nice romantic bath with some candles. I'm going to walk my dog. I'm going to do something like that. That's a luxury. But at work, when I hired somebody to do the paperwork, the processing, that person's still here today, by the way, Jolene, I used that newfound time to go generate more leads and more business. That is how you know when it's time to hire that person. When you make the commitment to use that time in a more productive way to grow your business. The only thing that could hold you back from doing that is if you financially haven't earned the right to do that.
Talk more about that.
What I mean, Chad, is that you have a good business, but you haven't saved enough reserves. And by hiring that person, it's going to put you or your finances or your home life in a bad situation. So what I did when I got started is I went off and I saved 3 months of that person's salary.
Is that pretty standard for you? 3 months of reserves? Is that something that you use as a baseline?
Yeah, 3 to 4 months. Because, Bob, if I was to go hire somebody and I had 3 months of reserves in their bank account, reserves that would cover that person's salary, that's all I'm risking. People think that if they hire somebody for 50 grand a year, they're risking 50 grand. No, they're risking 50 grand divided by however many work days in the year. They're risking $200.
All right, we don't do math on this podcast.
That's right.
We've
That's
talked
right.
about it.
That's right. That's all they're risking, because at the end of day one, if they suck, it's going to be their last day. You know, maybe they risk a week or a month, right? As long as you're willing to hold to the standards and get out of business with that person, you're not risking that much. I know that after 30, 60, or 90 days, I'm going to feel confident that I made a good hire and that I'm using that time more productive.
I heard a word in there, standards. So we have to make sure also we have standards before we start thinking about bringing those people on, because everybody who hires someone and wants them to do what they think, yet because they haven't created these standards, they don't think that the hired is doing the job correctly.
Because they aren't clear on what winning looks like. Our job as a leader is to be clearly explain how does that person succeed in their role. I hope that answers our audience question. If somebody had another question, where would they go to submit those?
All they would have to do is visit winmakegive.com and click on the button so that they can submit a question that we can possibly ask you on an upcoming episode. We appreciate you be willing to just take these questions, not knowing what's coming from our audience, Ben.
Always.
Okay, Bob. Powerful answers by Ben on helping people understand when it's time to add that leverage into their world. What was your takeaway from that conversation?
So, Chad, we live this, right? You and I have been around Ben. We've been in his world for the last 15 years. I mean, I've multiple times had Ben look over my shoulder and ask me what I was doing. And then when I told him what I was doing, be like, should you be doing that? Is that the highest and best use of your time right now? Like, who else in our organization that we pay less than we pay you could be doing that, right? Like, so we've lived this thing now there was a bunch of ahas in here, right? But if you don't live in our world, you hear these things every day or two, right? And you're out there, I would think that one of the big ahas would be, do I know what my time is worth? Right? And can I hire somebody to do that thing for cheaper than it costs me to do it? Most of the time, by the way, the answer is yes. And then, am I going to replace that free time I just took back with work, right? With more income producing activities or more of the things that I do that bring revenue to the business? And look, this can be challenging because I think initially you're like, okay, I got this free time. Like, what do I want to do with it? And I think a lot of people make the wrong decision of what to do with that time that they just, right? Which is why all of a sudden 3-6 months later, you're like, you got to let that person go because you can't afford them anymore. So, I mean, that's a really powerful answer, I think. But again, we've been living this. So I'd be interested to see if a lot of our listeners had the same kind of ahas that I think they got.
You know, Bob, I would suggest everyone go back to episode 5. And episode 5 is Win with Those Around You, where Ben talks about the fiduciary duties of a leader. And I think if you are ready to make that hire and you're going to make that hire and choose correctly to use your time, the luxury versus leverage that he talks about, that you need to make sure you're leading that person correctly in the right activities, which is why so many people can't make the hire. They're a control freak or don't know how to hold others to it. Go back, episode number 5, and check that one out before you make that hire. Now, what we want you to do is we want you to make sure you subscribe to the podcast, and we want you to ask Ben. So if you have a question you want to ask or you want to get subscribed to our podcast and you're not, just visit winmakegivepodcast.com. You can subscribe there, and you can find the button on the page to Ask Ben, so you can submit a question that we might choose on a future podcast episode. And until then, make sure that you're out there and you remember to do good.